Joshua Walker here at Japan Society for another exciting tea time. I'm particularly excited today to introduce you to our guest, who's Kumiko Makihara, who's written this great book that we're going to talk about, Dear Diary Boy. He's a longtime journalist and a good friend of Japan Society. Kumiko, how are you doing in the day of COVID and kind of being stuck at home?
Actually, not too bad. I'm very grateful to have a home to live in and the ability to work on my research and writing at home. I have the company of my son, who is furloughed from college, and here, he just finished up his semester online. So I'm very grateful for all of that. I have to say we have a bit of cabin fever. It's a one-bedroom apartment with two of us.
So, I mean, especially as an author who's written a book about motherhood and this extremely interesting story, maybe let's just start there. Tell us about the book and particularly some of the more relevant areas for people right now going through COVID-19.
Diary Boy is a cartoon character that my mother, Taro, my son's grandmother, drew and thought up in order to entice him to write entries in his diary. And keeping a diary was one of the requirements of this very competitive elementary school that he had gone to. And so my mother would draw these pictures of a little boy who feeds on diary entries and is always hungry. And she would hide them in his book bag or under his pillow. And in fact, one of the diary entries my son wrote said, "I get these strange letters all the time. And there's a picture of a boy, and the boy actually looks a lot like me." So the book is about the 6 years that my son attended this very competitive elite primary school in Tokyo. And it's about the challenges that both of us experienced. Mostly difficult, but there were a lot of happy times as well. And the challenges started with the entrance exams, where 5 or 6-year-olds sit for written tests and arts and crafts and athletics. And then once my son entered school, there was so much work. It was so competitive, and that was difficult for him as well as for me as the homework supervisor. And then for me, there was the whole Society of Mothers that was a group that I wanted to belong to, but I felt like I had to really work to be accepted into this group that socialized and was very tight-knit. So there are a lot of bizarre but interesting and sometimes very enjoyable, sometimes very difficult experiences that I hoped would be of interest to non-Japanese readers.
I mean, I have to say, as I was reading this book, it brought back a lot of memories of growing up in Japan, although I have to say I never was smart enough to go to one of these elite institutions. And as a foreigner, I always wondered what it would be like to try to fit in. And I thought your description of it here, almost as like an outside insider, was particularly fascinating. And I guess, what do you think it's like right now? Just recently, Japan has released its emergency law, but surely the COVID-19 environment has probably changed the landscape for those parents. Do you think it's gotten worse or better in that case?
Well, I think like the situation in the US, it's very difficult for parents to have children at home. I know the Japanese schools all closed. They may be opening up very soon, but to have to homeschool your child is very difficult, especially if you're a working parent. The articles I read here in the US in April were all about creative homeschooling and what you can do, but more recently the articles have been about giving up and asking questions like, is it okay to let my child go and play Fortnite for 8 hours? Or one mother wrote about asking her children to stay outside of her room. They could do whatever they want as long as they let her stay in her room and finish her work call. So I really empathize with the parents who are dealing with the lockdown right now. Most of the book is about my difficulties trying to get my son to do his schoolwork, and we would fight over it every day in the confines of a small apartment. And that was without the pandemic. So now I can only imagine that parents are having such a difficult time shut in their houses with their children who are likely explosive with pent-up energy. And those may be even the more fortunate families, because there are also families with disabled or sick children who don't have access to their normal aid sources.
Do you think if you were still in Japan right now and facing the possibility that the school year might be canceled, this would exacerbate and make things even worse? Like, how would you deal with that in the current environment?
Well, I remember at the time we had a similar situation because just before he was finishing elementary school, the earthquake struck in northern Japan, and the school did close. It was only for 2 weeks, but it closed. And we got cabin fever immediately. And in fact, I did have to send him to my parents' house so I could get a breather. So I think it would be very difficult.
So mentioning 3/11, you've, as a journalist, worked on that as well. And one of the things we've done in Japan Society is trying to look at lessons learned at previous crises, whether it's 3/11 in Japan or 9/11 here in New York. And what can we learn about resiliency? What has your work and your writing or your memories from that time brought back in the current environment? Things that you kind of remember vividly from being in Japan that 3/11 are now resonating with you now as we go through this crisis globally together?
Well, I think both disasters, especially from a parenting perspective, really offer an opportunity to discuss a lot of topics with your children. For example, in the US, the pandemic, I think, has really exposed social inequality. For example, access to healthcare or access to a place to shelter. And in my son's case, he came home from college and was finishing his semester online. And he was given an option, like most college students, of whether to take his classes pass, fail, or for a letter grade. And this actually gave us the opportunity to talk a little bit about social inequality among college students. For the most fortunate students, it's really a matter of which option is going to be best for my GPA. But there is a controversy about which option to offer students, and the people who are proponents of mandatory pass-fail for every student argue that that levels the playing field and doesn't disadvantage students who don't have the right environment to focus on their studies. Maybe they have to take on another job, or they don't have a quiet place to study or good Wi-Fi access. And then others say that they need a letter grade because they want to go to a graduate program that requires a letter grade, or they have employers that would be interested in a letter grade. So it was a good opportunity for us to discuss that. In general, I think disasters also fuel lots of information on the internet that, as it is a real teachable topic for younger children. Children need to be taught that there's a lot of fiction out there in addition to the facts, so they need to learn how to discern fact from fiction. Post Fukushima, there was a terrible trend where children who were sent to school in other areas would be bullied or taunted for being supposedly radioactive. And now similar things are happening with healthcare workers in Japan and their families, where people are trying to prevent them to go to daycare or for certain jobs because they claim that they're infectious. So it's a good chance to teach children that there's a lot of fiction out there in addition to the fact. And also just plain empathy. You be kind to other people and think about their positions. The act of wearing a mask is an example. You wear a mask to be considerate to other people. The other thing that is a positive aspect of these disasters, it is a great time for creativity. And the museums and theaters and artists and even ordinary people have shown incredible creativity and fun in expressing themselves and communicating with others during these restricted circumstances.
It sounds to me like one of the things that you explore in this book so well is kind of the idea of balancing all the parts of you as a person, all the parts of you as a parent, your own struggles and anxieties, and trying to do that with your child, where you're trying to show strength, but also make sure it's okay to ask questions. What advice do you have to working parents right now that may be stuck at home with their kids? They're trying to balance, homeschooling and very demanding jobs and just a world that we're not sure of, and just the level of uncertainty. We don't know when the vaccine's going to come. What advice do you have based on your own experience?
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, I really sympathize and empathize with these parents. I did get some good advice when I was going through this at home that unfortunately I regret that I did not follow. But my mother had told me when I was struggling to just remember that your child is only young once, and this is a fleeting moment, and it's not going to be like this forever. So you should really try to look at your child, as difficult it is, and step back and try to just enjoy the moment, because your child won't be that way for very long. when I think back about the times when my son was growing up, there's one incident when he was 7 years old, I think, and I was trying to rush him from one after-school activity to another. And I was saying, come on, Taro, hurry up. The sooner we get there, the sooner we'll. And he finished the sentence for me by saying, maybe we'll have time to go for a walk outside. And so while I was just had tunnel vision trying to get through the day, my son was fantasizing about going for a walk with me.
So it's almost like you wish you could take that and give it back to your earlier self, because I have two young children. I need to hear that all the time. And as you say it, I'm nodding my head and agreeing with you. But of course, something's going to happen tonight where they're going to really annoy me, or I'm going to get, upset and just want to hurry up and get them ready for bed. And you're right. 10 years down the road, I'm going to say, wait a minute. I just want to be able to just talk to you, tell a story, one more story, Daddy, or one more walk, Mom. I think that's particularly poignant. So tell me now, as a writer, what are you working on? What's next for you in terms of your projects? And has COVID thrown a wrench in any of your plans?
Actually, COVID, the lockdown, can be a great time for writers if you have the environment to work in and if you have a lot of self-discipline. I'm hoping to write another family memoir, this time looking back at my ancestors instead of my child. And I'm in the very preliminary stages, reading some old letters and diaries of my ancestors to see if they can be plotted out into a book.
Well, I particularly enjoyed reading this as a young parent myself, as someone who grew up in Japan that didn't have nearly the level of experience that you and Taro had of going through this very competitive school. But it really was both well done in terms of just being a joy to read and also just fun to explore. And there was both the humor and the dark that kind of merged in a very uniquely Japanese-American way that particularly those of us at Japan Society can appreciate. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. Any last word of advice to viewers that may be going a little stir-crazy, having a little bit of cabin fever at home that's helped you through crisis before, whether 3/11 or today?
Well, as I said earlier, it is really important to realize that your children are only going to be children for a fleeting moment. As for older parents, I read somewhere, and I try to do this as well, is when you feel really mad at your grown child, go back and look at some baby pictures.
Well, that is definitely the case. Hopefully we'll get some of those baby pictures that make everybody happy. It's the one nice thing about the internet, like you said. Hopefully we are able to come out of this as a kinder, more empathetic, and maybe some more baby pictures to go as well. So Kumiko Makihara, thank you so much for joining for today's Tea Time.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.